Welcome to the Sugar and Strength podcast. I'm your host, Kayla Girgen, and today we're going to be diving into a conversation about artificial sweeteners. And as a dietitian working with folks with continuous glucose monitoring, or CGM, I'm always getting asked whether or not artificial sweeteners are going to spike blood sugar or spike insulin. And we are going to dive a little bit deeper into that today. I'm going to share some of my favorite or most current recommendations. And I will say that I reserve the right to change my mind on some of the things that I'm sharing with you here today, because I think especially when it comes to artificial sweeteners, we're always learning more or seeing new sweeteners come out on the market. So I just want to say that if you're listening to this at a later date, I could have changed my mind by now. And I think that as a dietitian and weight loss coach in the field, it's okay to change your mind on things because as the research and information that we have gets better, I think that we're entitled to change our mind on things. And if you see people who are really stuck in their ways and don't want to change their mind, then I might take what they're saying with a grain of salt. Anyways, we are going to cover some frequently asked questions today, including artificial sweeteners. For example, what are the best ones to use? I'm also going to break down just sweeteners in general because I do get asked a lot about natural sweeteners. So things like maple syrup or agave or honey, are those better than things like aspartame or sucralose? So we will dive into that conversation. I do want to add that if you are someone who likes to follow along or have visuals, I am going to be sharing some slides and some charts today. So I might suggest pressing pause on this episode and catching this one over on YouTube. I'm going to be doing my best to describe what's on my screen, but if you like to have those visuals to go along, YouTube's going to be the place to grab this one. And while you're on YouTube, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. And with that, we'll get right into it. The first thing I want to say when we get into the conversation about artificial sweeteners is, spoiler alert, I think that they are the lesser of two evils, meaning that artificial sweeteners, or specifically non-calorie or lower calorie sweeteners, are going to be your better option compared to regular table sugar or natural sweetener. So for example, honey, maple syrup, agave, the things that are providing sugar, even though they are in the natural form, they are still sugar. And that is going to wreak havoc on your blood sugar as well. And when you're on that blood sugar roller coaster, it's really hard to get off. To begin, I just want to mention that when it comes to artificial sweeteners, it takes such a minuscule amount to get the same sweetness as table sugar that you really don't need a lot. And because a lot of these sweeteners have been around for so long, we have a lot of research on them. Just to give you an idea on the sweetness aspect, for example. So here is my table. And for those of you listening, again, I'll do my best to walk you through this. But at the top of the list, we've got sucrose. That is essentially table sugar. And the sweetness, if we're using that as a baseline, and aspartame, for example, is going to be about 200 times sweeter than table sugar. So to put that in perspective, if we were able to measure cup for cup and trying to get the same amount of sweetness of aspartame to sucrose, if I was trying to get 1 cup of table sugar and get the equivalent sweetness from aspartame, I would need a 1/4 teaspoon. Let me repeat that. I would need a 1/4 teaspoon of aspartame to get the equivalent of 1 cup of table sugar. This is one reason why I am in favor of artificial sweeteners or some of those even low or no calorie, even naturally occurring sweeteners. We'll talk about some of those here in a bit. But you need so little when it comes to artificial sweeteners, not to mention that they are not affecting your blood sugar, unlike table sugar. So table sugar is going to send your blood sugar to the moon and back. Something like aspartame or sucralose, for example, to give you some ideas, those brand names are Equal or Splenda. Those typically are not touching people's blood sugar. And that's something that a lot of folks are surprised to see when they're using something like a CGM, how some of these artificial sweeteners like aspartame or sucralose, so having a Diet Coke, for example, how that maybe doesn't affect their blood sugar like they thought it would. So on my chart here, you'll see a few different categories. And When we're talking about artificial sweeteners, these are synthetic sweeteners. So they are not naturally occurring. These are made in a lab, for example. So things like aspartame or sucralose. Saccharin used to be an older one. This was one of the first artificial sweeteners out there. So we might know these better by their trade names. So for example, saccharin, that is the same as sweet and low. Aspartame, this would be the same as NutraSweet or Equal, and then sucralose is essentially Splenda. And that's one that I feel like I see the most, especially in things like protein powders or protein bars. And you'll see here sucralose is 600 times sweeter than table sugar. So again, if we're using table sugar as our base, so many of these artificial or synthetic sweeteners are so much sweeter that you only need a minuscule amount. Now, I will say with that in mind, if you're doing some baking with some of these sweeteners, a lot of times they're using fillers so they measure more like table sugar. For example, if you're using a Splenda baking substitute, to get it to measure 1 for sugar when it's 600 times sweeter, they often are adding things like maltodextrin. So you're getting that same texture and the same amount of sweetness. But again, when we're thinking about baking, if I'm looking at using 1 cup versus a quarter teaspoon, that is really going to mess with your baking because essentially a recipe is like a science experiment. So a lot of times when you're using it in a baking setting, there are oftentimes a lot of things added. Next up on our chart, we have our sugar alcohols, and I'm going to dive into these a little bit later. But one thing that I want to point out here is you'll see that they are not necessarily 0 calories. So sorbitol and xylitol, these are about half the amount of calories for sugar, but they are digested a lot differently, which again, we'll talk about. So I will give you a couple cautions on the sugar alcohols. And last on our list, we have our naturally occurring sweeteners. These are things like stevia, monk fruit, and allulose. Stevia, for example, is 1 to 300 times greater than table sugar in terms of sweetness, and monk fruit is about the same as well. So things like stevia and monk fruit, a little bit really goes a long way. One thing that I will say with the naturally occurring sweeteners is stevia especially tends to have a bit of a bitter aftertaste. So one thing that I see a lot of people using are like the stevia drops, for example. They're very effective in that you only need a few drops to get that drink or that product really sweet, but they might have a little bit of an aftertaste versus something like monk fruit might be a little bit more mild. And then lastly, allulose. This is one of the newer sweeteners. It's something that I've really come to appreciate. I haven't used it a ton yet, especially in a baking setting, but I'm really appreciating allulose especially. This would be at the top of my list for sweeteners to use right now, just because when we're comparing it to some of the artificial sweeteners, so again, aspartame or sucralose, a lot of times what's happening is we're eating something sweet and our body's recognizing that sweetness, but our GI system isn't responding the same with that nutrition, meaning that we have sweetness on our tongue, but we don't have the calories coming in. So some people find that artificial sweeteners can really make them seek more sugar. And this is where I might caution on adding some of those artificial sweeteners because I see for some folks, it really tends to make them want more sweet things. So you know you best. If you find that doing something like skinny syrups or a 6-pack of Diet Coke a day is feeding those sweet symptoms, I might encourage you just to trim back a little bit and see if that helps let up on that. Because again, your brain is sensing, ooh, we've got some sweetness here, but it doesn't have the calories to follow. But what we're seeing is that allulose to the brain is acting more like table sugar, but without the calories. So we're seeing maybe less sugar-seeking tendencies with a sweetener like allulose, which is naturally occurring, not quite as sweet as something like sucrose, but it also doesn't have some of the GI side effects of sugar alcohols. So what I like about allulose is that you get that sweetness. You might need to think about ratios since it isn't quite as sweet as sucrose or table sugar. However, it's acting more like true table sugar in our brain and giving that satisfaction versus something like aspartame or sucralose, where we're getting the sweetness, but it's not really registering in those reward centers of the brain. Now let's pivot and talk about sugar and natural sweeteners for a bit, because this is something that I get asked about a lot. And what gets a little bit tricky is there are over 75 different names for sugar. And this is an outdated list, so I would imagine that this list is even greater now. So when you're looking at the label, it can be really difficult to decipher how much sugar is actually in something. But I've got a trick for you. So for those of you listening, I'll rattle off some of the sweeteners or different names for sugars that we have here. And just to clarify, these are sugars that are providing calories. These are sugars that are going to impact your blood sugar. And this includes everything from agave nectar to cane juice to cane sugar to carob syrup to dextrose to honey to icing sugar to coconut sugar to maltodextrin to malt syrup. A ton of different ways to essentially label sugar. But when you're looking at an ingredients list, some telltale signs of whether or not it's a sugar are: one, it'll end in ose, so OSE, that's a big sign that it's a sugar. It'll say sugar, so whether it's beet sugar or brown sugar or coconut sugar, that is a sweetener that's going to provide calories and impact your blood sugar. Syrup and juice are two other words too that you can look for that will indicate that this, yes, is a sweetener. It's going to provide the calories, impact your blood sugar. And then some other sneaky ones tend to be things like maltodextrin or dextrin, nectar. Some of these ingredients sound relatively harmless, but when we're looking at ingredients labels, again, what I see is that oftentimes manufacturers are using several different types of sugars, which prevents them from having to list sugar as the number one ingredient. So when you're looking at an ingredients list on, say, a cookie, for example, you might see that they use honey, table sugar, brown sugar, maybe some syrup of some kind. They do that in order to avoid having to list sugar as the number one ingredient, because those ingredients are listed by weight. So instead of using just sugar, they're going to use a variety of sugars. I do have a tip to help you out here when you're looking at a label to help sort through some of that noise. Another sweetener that I want to touch on that I get a lot of questions about is high fructose corn syrup. So I feel like there's so much mixed messaging around corn syrup. But what's interesting is if you're seeing my screen or my graph here, you'll see that sucrose or table sugar, it's about a 50-50 split of glucose and fructose. And I just want to stop here and mention that for my folks who are wearing a continuous glucose monitor, you are wearing a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor. You're only seeing glucose. You're not necessarily seeing fructose show up on your CGM, for example. So with something like table sugar, we're not seeing that full impact. Fructose goes down a different pathway and it goes to your liver. So it can be especially consumed in things like sugar-sweetened soft drinks or in large quantities from things like juice or other baked goods. It can be really hard on your liver because that fructose is going to your liver for digesting. But in the natural sense of things, like fructose in an apple, for example, is going to be much different and better received because it's got some fiber and some roughage, and it's less concentrated compared to something like a Coca-Cola, for example. So I just want to say that fructose isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's the quantities often and the concentrations that we're getting in the standard American diet, because we're getting things in liquid form, for example, that can really wreak havoc, especially on that liver health. So I think one of the number one things a person can do to improve their health if you are drinking regular pop is to replace it, whether that's with an artificial sweetener as a bridge, for example, going from something like regular Coke to Diet Coke or Mountain Dew to Diet Mountain Dew. If that's the bridge that you need to bring down that concentration of fructose, your liver will thank you for it. To make a long story short, when you're wearing a CGM, we're not always getting the full impact of sweeteners because sweeteners are made up of a variety of sugars, including glucose and fructose. Again, you're seeing the impact of glucose, which is a simple sugar. You're not necessarily seeing the impact of its counterpart, fructose. And we see whether it's a sweetener or whether it's a piece of fruit, those percentages or proportions of glucose to fructose is going to range depending on the fruits and sweeteners. High fructose corn syrup gets its name because it has more fructose than table sugar. It's not really all that much different than table sugar. To give you an idea, sucralose or table sugar is a 50-50 mix. So it has a glucose stuck to a fructose. And high fructose corn syrup only has 5% more fructose than table sugar. They're probably going to impact your blood sugar very similarly. So I know there's a lot of fear mongering about high fructose corn syrup, but it's really not that much different than your standard table sugar. Just a little something to think about. Moving on from high fructose corn syrup, I want to talk about another category of sweeteners that's certainly, I think, getting more attention. I'm seeing this in a lot more food products, especially keto or low carb products, and that is sugar alcohols. Sugar alcohols are essentially those sweeteners that end in OL. So you'll see this on the label as erythritol, xylitol, maltitol. They show up in a variety of different forms, but what happens is that sugar alcohols, they are maybe digested. I like to describe it a little bit more like fiber. The big concern around sugar alcohols is the side effects. So they tend to cause a lot of gas and bloating because they will travel through your GI tract relatively untouched. And then they get to your large intestine where your gut microbes are. And then your gut microbes, they like to munch on them, and that can create a lot of gas and bloating. It can draw water into your GI tract and cause diarrhea. So sugar alcohols is certainly something, especially if you have a sensitive tummy, to be aware of, especially in some of those keto or low carb products because of those side effects. If you have a tough gut and you're able to tolerate sugar alcohols, good on you. But for those of you, again, that have sensitive tummies, be sure to be on the lookout for sugar alcohols. Here, for example, what is nice in the realm of sugar alcohols is that there is actually a spot on the nutrition facts label that's going to delineate both your added sugars and your sugar alcohols. So for those of you that are listening, I have a label up of an Atkins bar, and this is showing about 10 grams of sugar alcohols. And some people might not bat an eye at that. Some people might be like, oh boy, no way. Like, my gut is not going to tolerate that. I find that for a lot of people, if a product has maybe 5 grams or less of sugar alcohols, that might be tolerated. This is highly individual. Some people tolerate sugar alcohols well, some people do not. But in general, I would say if you're looking for something like a food product, trying to get maybe less than 5 grams of sugar alcohols. But then on the other hand, I actually was at Menards, of all places. If you're not in the Midwest, Menards is essentially your Midwestern Home Depot. And they had a lot of protein products on sale, one being a grenade protein bar, and it had 17 grams of sugar alcohols, which I rarely see products that high. So I was a little bit nervous. We bought a handful because they were $1 a piece. They tasted wonderful. And surprisingly, neither my husband or I had any side effects. So maybe it was a specific type of sugar alcohol. I can't remember what exact sugar alcohol was used in the protein bar, but just know if you find that you've maybe incorporated a new protein bar and now all of a sudden you're gassy or you've got diarrhea. I've seen this come up with bubblers, the drink, for example. I was on a phone call with a family member trying to troubleshoot their mysterious diarrhea. And I was like, oh, I think it's the 4-pack of bubblers you're doing a day. That is 30 grams of sugar alcohols or whatever it was. If you notice that you've got new GI symptoms, they might coincide with something like a keto or low carb or high protein product. So I encourage you to check out the nutrition facts, see if you can see the sugar alcohols, or if you're looking at the ingredients, you will see those sweeteners again that end in the OL. So for the label that I'm showing here, the sweetener that shows up number 2 in the ingredients list is maltitol. Otherwise, some things to look out for on the label, specifically when it comes to those added sugars. So at the beginning of the episode, I showed you that list of 75 different names for sugars. The nice thing is that on the nutrition facts label, you'll see under total carbohydrates, so right above where you look at where the protein is, you'll see includes X amount of grams of added sugars. So that's going to take all of the sweeteners and add those up together. Typically, when I'm looking at a nutrition label, I'm looking at a couple of different things. Number one, I'm always looking at the added sugars. The lower, the better, typically. And then usually I'm looking at protein, but it's not always my number one factor. Typically, I'm looking at added sugars, trying to limit those in the scope of balanced blood sugar. But I also think that food pairing, like what you're having with this particular snack, can really make a difference as well. So more so than what one product is doing, I think it matters what you're eating as a whole. What are you pairing with that? Are you going for a walk afterwards? There's a lot of ways to impact your blood sugar than what's going in your mouth, meaning that movement and stress management and how you sleep, all of those factors come into play as well. To wrap up here, let's talk about a few considerations when you're wondering whether or not you might want to experiment with a sweetener, whether to add or avoid it, maybe do some trial and error. First and foremost, thinking about side effects, notably for sugar alcohols. So again, if you have a sensitive stomach, I might have you shy away from something like the sugar alcohols, which draw water into your system. They can create some gas and bloating or diarrhea. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is how aspartame and sucralose can impact your gut health. Specifically, they can change the microbes in your gut to be a little less favorable. However, I might argue that if you're doing the real thing, like table sugar or high fructose corn syrup or whatever kind of juice or syrup you're using to sweeten your foods, I think that the trade-off is a blood sugar roller coaster as well. So one quote that I love, especially when it comes to nutrition, is that there are no solutions. There's only trade-offs. So if your goal is gut health, then maybe you're not using something like aspartame or sucralose. However, if your goal is balanced blood sugar, then maybe you're using some of these. So there's always going to be some sort of trade-off or a positive and negative. So it's up to you to weigh those pros and cons to ultimately figure out what's best for you. A couple other benefits that I also haven't mentioned are sweeteners like xylitol. We actually know that this can help prevent dental caries or cavities. So you'll see xylitol oftentimes in gums, actually. So if you are using chewing gum, they do use sugar alcohol, specifically xylitol, in a lot of sugar-free gums, and that can help prevent cavities. I will caution, if you're chewing a heck of a lot of gum and you notice again that you've got some stomach upset or you feel really gassy or bloaty, it might be your gum, which might not always be the obvious symptom. And then I also mentioned how currently allulose is one of my favorite sweeteners. It's at the top of my list right now for being one of the most satiating while providing the least amount of calories. So again, with allulose, it's not quite as sweet as table sugar, so it might not measure one for one. However, our brain is registering it much like it would with table sugar, and we're not necessarily seeing some of those sugar-seeking tendencies like we might with artificial sweeteners like aspartame and sucralose. And I absolutely want to add that you can certainly eat your favorite foods and still lose weight and still see results. It's not always about calories alone or grams of sugar. And this is where I really love CGM because I feel like it can help you get that great balance of incorporating those foods that you love. You find out what's worth it. You find out what keeps you fueled. And ultimately, when you're balancing your blood sugar, your appetite is going to be much more regulated as well. And I can't emphasize that enough, how often I see somebody coming in on the blood sugar roller coaster. Their blood sugar is up and down and up and down. And once we smooth that out, a lot of that food noise just disappears. And when that is gone, we can really work on the psychology of eating. Why are you eating? If you find that you're turning to emotional eating a lot of times to maybe soothe yourself after a stressful day, I can't emphasize enough how CGM can really help not only spot some of these sneaky sources of added sugars, but it can really help see what lifestyle is doing as well. If you're interested in learning more about CGM or working with me, I will include links below for both my free CGM guide and also my application link to apply. When you have a coach who really knows how to interpret some of this data and can really help give you guidance, not to mention the accountability that comes with CGM because I can see all of your data, it really can make a world of difference because CGM can be overwhelming getting all of that data. And if you need somebody to help be a calm, steady voice, help you really focus on what is going to help you make the most progress with the minimal amount of change, I am here for you. Ultimately, some takeaways that I hope to leave you with today are when it comes to artificial sweeteners, a little bit goes a long way since they are so much sweeter than table sugar. Artificial sweeteners aren't inherently bad. I think that, in fact, they can be very helpful, especially used in moderation because they are so much sweeter. But again, when you're finding that you're doing tons and tons of skinny syrups or a lot of Diet Coke, for example, and you notice that sweet tooth just doesn't go away, I might encourage you just to scale back a little bit to see if some of those artificial sweeteners are feeding some of those sweet cravings. So that might take a little bit of gentleness and guidance as well. Also, just because a sweetener is natural doesn't mean it's blood sugar friendly. For example, things like honey, maple syrup, agave nectar, these are natural sweeteners, but they still provide a ton of sugar and they are going to wreak havoc on your blood sugar, especially if you're eating those things on their own or combined with other carbohydrates. So just because something's natural doesn't necessarily mean that it's blood sugar friendly. When it comes to research on what we have on things like saccharin or sucralose or aspartame, generally we are seeing these things as very safe with maybe some slight negative metabolic effects. Those which I mentioned are things like changing the makeup of your microbiome and then also maybe leading to some sweet seeking if you find that you're doing a lot of these artificial sweeteners. But again, ultimately, I think quantity can really make a difference here. Is this something where you're having pumps and pumps and pumps of sugar-free syrups all day, or are you just enjoying a handful of things a week? I think frequency and amount can really play into the picture here. With that, I hope this episode was helpful in clarifying some things about artificial sweeteners. If you have further questions about sugars or CGM or artificial sweeteners, I'm also going to include in the show notes my Ask Me Anything box. So if you want to submit any questions for future AMAs, I would love to hear from you. I would like to do an AMA or Ask Me Anything specifically on CGM. So if you have anything that you're toiling around, or maybe you've been using CGM and you have no idea what to do with that data, hop into the show notes and submit your question in the Ask Me Anything box. With that, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, and I look forward to catching you on the next episode.